Okay, let's get started. Welcome to the World Economic Forum debate on green growth. Good afternoon. We're going to be talking about green growth and new models for African economic development. Over the next hour, we'll be discussing opportunities for using green technology to power the next chapter of Africa's growth story. We'll examine how and if that's possible, or frankly even desirable given the continent's need for rapid and cheap industrialization and job creation. We meet, of course, at a time of unsettling global economic trends. On this continent, the Africa Rising narrative has long since given way to profoundly divergent growth stories. And many African economies find themselves in a quandary. They need to rapidly industrialize, yet they're being disproportionately affected by climate change and by pollution and greenhouse gases that weren't of their own making. So the key question for our panelists today is this: can Africa achieve high growth without harming the environment? And do the continent's policymakers even have a choice? I'm Joe Parkinson. I'm the Africa Bureau Chief for the Wall Street Journal. And I'm very pleased to have four eminent panelists with me here today to address these important questions. From my left, Claver Gatete, Finance Minister of the Republic of Rwanda; Lesetja Kganyago, Governor of the Central Bank of South Africa; Amadou Hott, Vice President of the African Development Bank; and Londres Signe from Stanford University's African Studies Center. Now, this is, of course, a vast subject area, but I'd like our panelists to kick off with perhaps some optimism and what's already been achieved. I think it makes sense to start with Rwanda, which, of course, has been one of the most enthusiastic adopters of green growth and green technology to power growth. So, Minister, if I could start with you. We've seen more than a 90% increase in solar power since 2014. You've said the country needs to keep accelerating towards green growth. Tell me, what does green growth mean in the Rwandan context? What steps are you most proud of, and what comes next?
Yeah, thank you very much. For us, green growth is more than energy. It's, I would say it's life. Our country is more mountainous, and it's a small country, so the risks are very, very, very high. And when you talk about green growth, it's not only, it's energy, it's agriculture, it's water, it's how we develop as an economy. And we're looking at it comprehensively, trying to see how we can grow, but also taking into account the environment. There is no way we can sustain the growth, no matter how much we invest, without thinking about the environment. So for us, the environment and the green side is enshrined in everything that we do. It's a cross-cutting issue. That's why anybody who has ever invested in Rwanda, if you don't do an environmental impact assessment, you can never get your project up and running. And whenever we do energy, the first thing is, how green is it? If the tree planting that we do normally almost every Saturday of the last month, we call it, it's public works, we call it Muganda. Tree planting is almost compulsory in most of the things that we do. So for us, it's a way of life. And that's why from the recent estimation, that is almost taking 1% of our GDP in Rwanda. And that's why we came up with that policy of the green growth. We came up with a fund, the Green Fund, that has been on, where the government of Rwanda contributes money, the donors make a contribution. Now we're asking the private sector also to make a contribution to deal with so many issues, from energy to because when you are doing agriculture, in our case, when it is mountainous, there is a whole landslide that comes down. We are dealing with that. We are taking the people living in those areas which are not supposed to be habitable to other areas, how we do agriculture, how we do water, so that we make sure that whatever we do, whether it is irrigation, it has to be sustainable. And any development in Rwanda has to be sustainable, has to look at that element of sustainability. So that's what we are doing to make sure that whatever we do, if we don't take care of the environment, the consequences are heavy for us in terms of the sustainable economic development. Yeah.
Governor, that's a very holistic approach we've just heard detailed from the Rwandans. Rwanda's a small country and at a different stage of its economic development to South Africa. How do things look in South Africa? You have an incredible geological inheritance. We were just talking about the wind not perhaps being as strong in Durban as it is in Port Elizabeth, but you have seas, space, all of this inheritance and potential. What do you think about green growth being part of the government strategy? Are you happy with what's being done? You see a lot of potential for more development?
Well, I think that what becomes clear is that greening growth is no longer an option, but it's become a necessity. And for a country like South Africa, which is actually a big emitter, because we have had an energy strategy that had relied on resources that we had in abundance, and in this case, it was coal. So we had our energy very much being driven by coal, and coal is quite polluting. What has been done in greening the growth? Well, one thing that became clear was that we couldn't, coal is a resource we had to use it. And at the time, I think that we had to apply for a loan at the World Bank, and that was used to change the energy mix. First was going for a clean coal technology that tried to capture the greenhouse gases. And secondly, as part of that loan was to build the largest, at the time, solar power station in the Northern Cape. But I think that we've got to also be cognizant. I mean, with that, it needed water. So these things don't always synchronize. So where we had an abundance of sun, was also a place where we had a shortage of water, and you have to balance that. But I think that coming from a central bank, obviously I will have to talk about finance. I think that the minister here had very eloquently captured the key elements to say that this thing is not just about energy, but South Africa embarked on a renewable energy power program, which was actually very successful, and added some 6,000 megawatts to the national grid. We did pay school fees much earlier, but we learned how to do these things, and it almost became a template that many other countries could easily use, because it was an investment that was driven not by government finance, but by government creating a regulatory framework to enable independent power producers who were mainly in the renewable energy space to come into play. It was also a very important driver of investment over a 2 to 3 year period. I think that there are also massive opportunities, and the massive opportunities are that there is an emergence of green finance, and so hard questions are being asked about the responsibility of lenders to the environment, and you are seeing lenders and investors who are starting to say that, well, we are allocating this amount of money just to fund green projects. And I think there's a UN initiative which involves 27 institutional investors who control in excess of $3 trillion, who have said that they would commit about $600 billion towards green bonds and green finance. And that is going to be a driver of the technology, because they are saying that we are looking at environmentally friendly technologies, we are looking at green technologies, and it's any business that is looking for funding to ignore that big pool of funding that is potentially there. You could only do that at your own peril. And the last point that I wanted to make then had to do with then what kind of regulatory changes are required. I mean, governments do the one thing, and of course, if you ask bureaucrats, how do you solve this problem? Bureaucrats, we're good at one respect that we are very competent in is to pass laws and formulate laws and regulations, and that is what we would do. But then there was a drive that was involving the private sector, the task force on climate-related financing disclosures, which basically was to change the conduct of the institutional investors to basically come with recommendations that would force disclosures of climate-related related risks, and identified things in 4 categories and with respect to what all businesses, whether it is corporates or it is financiers or it is investors, what are you doing in terms of your governance structures to deal with climate-related risks? How does that impact on your strategies in terms of opportunities? What risk management do you have in place, and what metrics do you use to measure climate-related risks?
Amadou, the governor talks about increased pools of money, increased regulatory sophistication and incentives to pull people in this direction. Your job as head of green growth, a new department at the African Development Bank, is also indicative of that. If you can tell us a little bit about the work that you've been doing, and also pull the camera back a little bit perhaps for people like me. I have to be honest with you, before researching this panel, green growth was a buzzy, nebulous kind of term that I'd heard bandied around, but I didn't really understand what it meant. How do you define it? And do you define it in the same kind of holistic way as the governor and the minister have just explained so eloquently?
Yeah, thank you, Joe. Actually, at the bank, green growth is at the center of the new strategy of the High Five, which were developed when the new president, Dr. Adesina, came on board. And amongst the High Five, of course, energy at the top, but also agriculture, feeding Africa, industrializing Africa, moving Africa to the top of the value chain, but also integrating Africa and specifically improving the lives of the African people. And pursuing a green growth strategy would help you definitely achieve those High Five, specifically because of changes in technology, innovations, and so on and so forth. That is why the bank has created this new vice presidency. We are the only MDB that has done so, that focus both on power, energy, climate change, and green growth under one umbrella, both from the public sector side and the private sector side. About 100 staff focused on this big theme. From the bank's perspective, we see actually green growth as a new sort of developmental pathway that will enable Africa achieve, number 1, growth, 2, in a sustainable manner, and 3, also in a climate resilient manner as well. And we think this is very strategic. That's why the bank is pooling a lot of resources in this area. In the energy sector, $12 billion for the next 5 years. And out of that $12 billion, we want green mitigation projects, which is mostly renewable energy projects, to be sort of developed. But it doesn't mean that we'll do only renewable energy projects. There will be some projects, of course, who will be fossil fuel because of the comparative advantage that some countries provide. But the bank's push is towards a low-carbon, climate-resilient pathway so that the countries can grow and impact less the environment as well. Yeah.
Landry, we've heard from the policymakers, we've heard from the development institutions. It's a positive view about a greener future. I'm wondering, as an academic, you've studied a lot about democratic systems in Africa, political evolutions in Africa, whether you're as optimistic that this is going to go from, our conversations in Davos and elsewhere to spread across the continent and form a new model. How optimistic are you about this for Africa's future, how important it will be?
I would like to first establish the connection between environment and economic performance. So economic growth cannot be achieved without environment. For example, we know that we need, on one side, capital investment, but we also need technological innovation. On the environmental side, we need energy, resources, as well as the capacity to absorb environmental waste. So if on one hand, environment is indispensable, on the other hand, economic performance also will result in waste for the environment, in many consequences for the environment. And the third aspect of this is the fact that environmental policies can also help mitigate the bad economic effect of the accelerated growth. Having said that, and coming to the fundamental of economic growth, capital and technological innovations are extremely important. And that is what we don't have enough in Africa. So although we can be enthusiastic about the environmental aspect of the determinant of economic growth, so Africa has enough land, natural resources, etc., we do not have enough capital, and we are lagging also in terms of technological innovation. Just a quick comparison, the endowment of Stanford University is much higher than the budget of numerous African countries. So although I want to share the optimism of the panelists, I will rather say that the advantage of Africa is that we are forward thinking instead of being backward thinking compared to the other industrialized country or developed nations. But without capital and without more technological innovation, we will not be going far.
I'm wondering, Amadou, on that point, whether you're already seeing winners and losers emerging, whether you're already seeing pockets of great progress and case studies. I know it's in its infancy, this program, but where you're seeing case studies, countries doing incredibly well, and whether there's a correlation between perhaps strong government and being able to push through the kind of reforms that are seeing progress on this front. If you can talk a little bit about the case studies you're working with on the field so we can get a sense for how it's actually working in practice.
Yeah. You know, as the professor said, capital is absolutely important. Technology is important. Capital is available worldwide. That is why strong governance, good governance, competent governance is absolutely important to attract capital, because this is the way you can develop green projects, you can develop new projects, and so on and so forth. Rwanda is doing very well. Ethiopia also is making very good progress. Morocco also is doing a great job, in particular in renewable energy. We see actually a lot of capital chasing actually few ready renewable energy projects. You have a list of projects, but often the projects are not yet well structured to attract the investors.
So you've got more money than you can give away.
You have at this stage today, but if you were able to develop all the projects that Africa needs, for example, to achieve universal access to electricity over the next 10 years, we may have a gap in terms of capital, but today we have more resources actually chasing few projects, because developing projects takes time. Some African countries do not have yet the clear plans between, on their energy mix, for example, even if most of them have, because most of them also have signed the Paris Agreement. For example, you can see last year, $35 billion were invested in the energy sector, for example. If I take the energy part of green growth, right? 35 billion, about 7 billion out of that 35 billion came from the private sector. The rest came from the DFIs and also the African government. It does not mean that actually the private sector is not interested. It's because this is the way the projects are structured today. Because most of the time you need sovereign guarantees, you need DFIs debt to put those projects forward. But what we're expecting is that in the future, that most of these projects, once they start to generate cash flows, you can take out, let's say, some of the DFI's debt and replace it with long-term institutional capital once the risk has gone down, for example, drastically, right? In the same time, also, developed countries have committed to fund about $100 billion per year to fund developing countries to help them actually achieve their targets following the signing of the Paris Agreement. It's not only capital, but it's also technology. We are seeing some of that money, but again, many African countries are not accessing that money. Today, about 3% of the available climate finance go to Africa. But in the same time, Africa, has the suffer the biggest impact of climate change. We see that in Ethiopia, we've seen that even in South Africa, where the government has to mobilize $700 million against the effect of climate change and droughts and things like that. You see that also in West Africa as well. And what we need is to make sure that the African countries have access to, let's say, weather insurance. For example, the Africa risk capacity that the African Development Bank is supporting is a good instrument, but not all African countries can pay the premium to be insured against climate change, for example. We want the climate finance to finance some of those premiums for the poor countries.
Minister Amadou talks about countries needing to do more to be able to tap the money that's available. Rwanda's had incredible success in managing to get financing from IFIs and elsewhere. What have you done that's worked, and what works as a template perhaps for other countries? Are the lessons that you've learned applicable elsewhere? Rwanda's a small country, has a particular governance structure. You're confident that the moves that you've made could be rolled out across parts of the continent?
Well, I can only talk about my country and then other countries. Each country is different, but I think the most important two factors, first of all, is policy, is re-understanding that environment is a necessity. Conserving environment is a necessity, and policies that go with it must be very clear. Second is leadership. A committed leadership, meaning that they will always question whether we have the right policies and how they are being implemented. In the case of Rwanda, there are many things that actually do not require money. Some of them are like rules, for example. We saw that immediately after the genocide in 1994, people would construct anywhere. Companies would construct even in swamps, everywhere. There were no rules of the game. And now we are dealing with the consequences, getting them outside the place where they're not supposed to be. And there are rules on where to construct, how to construct, make sure that you conserve the environment. At the same time, for cars, for vehicles, also the rules that govern the pollution. And also the making sure that you have the necessary facilities to make sure that every car in Rwanda, every year you have to go and take it for checking to see how much pollution, how much contribution to the pollution that is contributing, so that you get rid of those that are not supposed to be in the system. In the areas of energy, where we have, in most cases, we have the geothermal, which we are now testing. We have the methane gas. We have hydropower. We also have the renewables, including what you mentioned as solar, and also other methods in the rural areas that we use. Biogas that is used almost across the country in the rural areas, but also the improved energy stoves to make sure that you don't use much of the wood, especially cutting, which has been the case in the case of Rwanda. And this really creates almost a lot of problems. We are, as I said, a mountainous country. During the rainy season, that's when you see the landslides, that's when you see the floods. There is a lot of impact on our government, on our country. And also during the dry season, that's when you see the drought, and which has also other impact. And that's why tree planting becomes compulsory for everybody. So for us, we are looking at almost all sectors. We are working on a project on urbanization for about 6 cities in the country. We are working with Professor Paul Collier of Oxford University. Okay. But what we are looking at is everything from the transport, how green is it? The housing, how green is it? Everything that we use almost in the construction part, how green are they? And also what kind of mix of energy are you using in terms of for those urban areas, before even you go to the rural areas. And then from there, we determine where we should subsidize, what resources we should mobilize, and making sure that it also informs the policy choices that we make. We have so many companies because the way we do it is now we are targeting the renewable energy is now 3% of the total energy mix, but we are targeting, but by the end of next year, it will be 22% of the energy mix, in most cases in the rural areas, even for the people mainly who are not on the grid, who are off grid, and we have resources for that. It's not really very difficult, I would say. It's not an issue of resources, it's an issue of direction and how you implement these kind of policies on a more permanent basis.
You talk about implementation, you talk about having quality policy implementation, you're talking about big numbers to 22%. Mm-hmm. How do you ensure accountability? How do you ensure people are included in those decisions?
In Rwanda, it's different. It's different because our system is that once we agree on a policy and a direction of what we need to do, we sign a performance contract. Once you do it, and you have discussed it, there's resources allocated, the rest you sign a performance contract. Ours is simple. You either perform or you are out. There's nothing in between. To the extent that we are held accountable in many ways. Let me just give you one example. We are held accountable apart from the performance contracts. There is even a way the public holds us accountable. Every December, we have what they call the National Dialogue, which is in our Constitution. A meeting for 2 days that's chaired by the president, and all the Rwandans are hooked in, all of them, in the country and outside the country. They use any method, whether it is a phone, whether it is a Twitter, whether it is an SMS, whether it is Facebook, anything they use to ask us questions, openly in public, and you must answer them. So if you're a Minister of Finance, who is almost in charge of everything, they ask you every question: why didn't you pay this? Why didn't you give electricity? Why didn't you build the roads? Why didn't you do this? Every minister answering openly. So if you really cannot answer those questions, the public already has written you off. So that's why you have to do very hard, you have to work very hard, make sure that you perform, in addition to the performance contract. So that way, the public holds us accountable. Of course, if they don't succeed, we have a national leadership retreat where of about 600 people, where the people will hold you accountable. And these are specific questions on where you have a policy, where you have the action plan, where you have performance contract, why didn't you do what you're supposed to do? So for us, the issue is not really performing. And that's why many countries are lacking, because you may have good ideas, you may have even the money, but the execution is different. The execution for us is the most important, is number one, that whatever you have, whatever you know, that you have resources for, do it, and do it very fast.
We're talking about execution in the domestic context, but I want to talk about challenges and a changing, perhaps, international climate. We're all thinking about this every day, I'm sure, and partly exhausted by it, but there's a new government in Washington that's taking a very different approach to climate policy. It seems to be much more skeptical. We still haven't really got that much skin on the bones in terms of Africa policy from the Trump administration. But they do seem to be more skeptical about this. No matter how much you're doing, Governor, I wonder what you think about this. How would the different mood music in Washington and the president still not actually making any commitments on agreements in Paris, for example, how is that likely to potentially change or derail or suck the momentum out of this green growth that we've been saying is inevitable and the only solution and the only way to go?
I think that's the question you were supposed to have asked the minister. Because as central bank governors, we do not ply that trade. But let me just say that I think that as you are talking about greening the growth, you're going to have to manage the interests of, ask your question, who are the winners and who are the losers? And part of the reason why microeconomic reform is so difficult is because the political leadership struggle to manage the contestation between the winners and the losers. So now, so back to Washington. So you then have to ask yourself, the new administration in Washington, what does it face? Who are the people who are seeing themselves as losers, and who are the people who then say that, no, but this is for the benefit of all of us? And how do you then bring the losers along? I think that it would be a tragedy if the new administration does not meet the obligation in terms of the international agreements that we have. I think that worryingly is the rise of protectionist noise, because you see, we are in a continent which is, for all intents and purposes, is made of countries which are small open economies, and as such, we rely on trade, we rely on investment and the transfer of technology. We'd like to leapfrog the technology. So if you have the noise like well, if you are an American company, you've got to be producing this here, so you can't even go and invest elsewhere and produce it in another. So I think that it will raise challenges for the continent. And I think that if you are going to end with a situation where the new administration decides to do something with AGOA, for example, the Africa Growth and Opportunities Act, and decide that they are going to make changes that are detrimental to the continent, then we are going to be having significant problems. But back to the continent, just to say that this thing about managing winners and losers. I mean, we in South Africa had the opportunity that the national electricity utility also felt that they had particular power plants which are reaching the end of their useful life. And they are saying, well, we are going to have to replace this with cleaner power stations. So that offers an opportunity. But technology is also moving so fast that we are in a situation where the cost in any case of greening the economy is coming down very rapidly. And the part of it has been this change, even in the investor community, that starts to say that, no, sorry, how do you manage all of this? I may like to conclude and say that being a central bank, I would be remiss if I do not then talk about potentially if the regulators of the financial sector do not get alive to the issues of climate-related risks, and what they mean for the financial sector, we are going to have a problem. And a part of this effort of the Financial Disclosures Task Force was to basically come with a disclosure standard or recommendations in terms of disclosure, because regulators would like to have this information so that they know what risks would the financial sector be exposed to. Investors would want to have this information because if they are to drive a change in behavior, they need to be able to know which technologies have got implications for greening, or which technologies are actually continuing to be dirty in terms of the growth. And through the allocation of capital, you could actually change a significant, you could drive a significant change in behavior. So you have got a coalescence here where you have not just governments in the form of policemen, but you also have an interest where the people who are looking at the financial sector and consequences for the financial sector are beginning to say, hang on, am I fully aware of the climate-related risks here? And if you are going to be driving the greening, how are you going to be doing it? And then so for that reason, you are going to actually be needing a lot more disclosure.
I'm wondering, Landry, you're the only one of us who actually lives in the United States. You've got experience of what's happening with the government over there. We talk about these kind of perhaps irreversible moves towards getting a better regulatory structure to accommodate green growth and environmental challenges and asymmetric risks. How does it feel in DC listening to the mood music, and do you think that we're perhaps approaching a sea change, a real difference in relations between Washington and the continent from this administration?
So, broadly speaking, when we study the American foreign policy, we look at 4 drivers: peace, prosperity, power, and principle. And the current administration perceives environment as a principle rather than an economic opportunity related to prosperity. So I think this is probably one of the challenges that the optimists about green growth will be facing. Having said that, in terms of foreign aid, I think the new administration may represent an opportunity for African leaders to become independent. We have seen that it is likely to have the foreign aid cut, with the budget cut, for example, with USAID. Probably AGOA will be protected given the new, I think it was extended to 2025, something. So But although Trump is pro-business, he has neither done any clear act toward promoting investment and trade with Africa or even with other regions. Most of the actions were rather protectionist. So these, of course, constitute challenges for Africa, but I think it also represents opportunity because African leaders now have the responsibility to define which type of model they want, to be accountable and to mobilize resources from multiple other partners, including from the East, in order to achieve economic performance. So people in DC, I spent some time at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and people are not necessarily the Woodrow Center, but in the DC community in general, are not very optimistic about how the administration will be handling the relation with the continent. But this offers also an opportunity for the leaders and the different policy leaders around this panel to really shape and be self-determining for the future of Africa, especially related to green energy.
I'm conscious we're going to throw it open
Maybe if
for...
I can,
Please, come in.
If I can come in, I think he's making a very important point. And my president, I think last month, May 20, was in Washington, D.C. Somehow, some of the challenges becomes an advantage and a wake-up call for our leaders to really think differently and not rely on the United States foremost for everything. When we had the financial crisis, it was followed by the quantitative easing. You remember United States Central Bank used to pump in almost 85 billion every month. And actually, most of the money was coming to also leading to Africa. We could see most of the investments really coming in because as many investors were cashing in, they were getting quite a significant amount of money. Now, when it dried up, I think it was in October 2015 when they stopped. The resources, the quantitative easing resources that were coming from the European Central Bank and the Bank of England was really not sufficient. And we saw a squeeze in that. And that was also followed by the hike in the interest rates in the United States that really affected us significantly, our own countries. We saw the foreign exchange really becoming very high, affecting all our own countries. The money that was coming to be invested was slowing down. And really it reminded us that we needed to develop our capital markets on the continent. And now people have woken up, even people who never used to talk about it. We decided to say, well, we can have to do something to attract private money. If we don't do it, we cannot wait for the goodwill of how the policies are going to affect us. So we have seen that side of the story, and we are readjusting accordingly. Only that was followed by other shocks, like the commodity shocks that you know that has happened for the last 2 years. But what the environment thing is also showing us is that we also need not to rely on someone doing it. We can continue to have a discussion and see what can change, but we need to do the very minimum, the very basic things that we need to do as far as environment protection is concerned. And we have to innovate and making sure that we also have a role to play and also the leadership on the African continent in this area. The rest will be negotiation with the different partners, but it cannot stop us because the United States is not doing much. But we can also keep engaging, but at the same time also doing something on our own countries, even at a small scale, according to our means. But we cannot stop and then say, well, if someone doesn't take an action, we can sit by and wait until they are ready. I think we need to start doing things on our own and also take leadership where necessary.
I should say, it's a bit of a plug, but that call of self-reliance from President Kagame first came in an interview with the Wall Street Journal before he went to Washington, D.C. Amadou, you wanted to come in on that point as well. And just one point that the minister mentioned before that I wanted to pick up on, another challenge, which is demographics. Africa's, demographic inheritance, or is it, going to be something that's much more difficult to deal with? One of the world's fastest urbanization rates, people moving from arable land, from villages into cities, often with inadequate infrastructure. How does that reconcile with green growth? All of these people pouring into the cities at the moment.
Yeah. That is extremely important, and we cannot achieve development without having people leaving arable land and do other activities. We cannot have 80% of the population or 60% just doing lower yielding agriculture. We need to support more agriculture so that we can get better yield, but also transform our agricultural product before exporting them, but also becoming a net exporter of food instead of being today a net importer of food. And for that, you need massive investments, and that is the number 2 priority of the bank, Feed Africa. But to come back to the issue of the new administration, for us, we would say that it's an opportunity. Opportunity, first of all, as the minister and professor said, to free up ourselves and really take our future in our own destiny, and to say that we have to lead where we want to go, and not just to depend on the US or to any other country, for example. That is number 1. And number 2, often, I mean, lately for the past few years, some projects, especially some fossil fuel, in particular coal projects, have had some issues finding funding. While at the African Development Bank, our energy policy does not exclude coal or other, let's say, sort of fossil fuel. However, we are encouraging the countries to do more renewable energy. It's not because only for climate issues, but because also renewable is becoming much more cheaper and cheaper. By 2030, solar will be the cheapest or second cheapest after gas. So it makes sense to do more of that because economically it makes sense. In the US also, I think it's too late to come back and try to sort of fight renewable energy. Why? Because I read recently that it is creating 3 times more jobs than the fossil fuel industry. And as you know, President Trump is all about making America great again, and you cannot make it great again without creating jobs. I don't see them fighting renewable energy because it means you're going to reduce jobs. Tesla is creating jobs. And the research that is being done in renewable energy is absolutely fundamental. Imagine in the next few years, if we can develop batteries that are very cheap, you combine them with renewable energy and batteries, it could be cheaper than having maybe even a gas-fired plant. Why not? And research should continue. And I think that Tesla and co will put the right pressure, and the population will put the right pressure for the government to not come back onto this issue. As far as we're concerned, at the African Development Bank, we fund all sort of technologies. We are technology neutral. And actually, the arrival of Trump could be also an opportunity because until recently, we could not talk to OPEC about coal projects. But I think with the new administration, if we have a coal transaction, we will not fund it alone because our policy is that we don't fund alone. We always co-invest with others. And with this, I think we'll get more people willing to fund ultra, super clean coal technology, including we have the Japanese, the Koreans are interested to put facilities in place to help when it's required. But remember, in the long term, renewable energy will be much cheaper than even coal, very likely.
Opportunities abound. We've got 15 minutes for some questions from the audience. Please let us know who you are and who you're with. Nobody for now?
Looks like everything was very clear.
Everything was covered, super clear. So just on that last point when you were talking about soon the technology will make all of this so much cheaper and an easy decision for governments to make. We've just come out of the commodity crisis. A lot of governments are really struggling to afford basic power, let alone a green future. Do you really feel like you can compel places that are poor in the continent, places that are suffering, need bailouts to try and make this investment in the future? Are you finding that governments from poorer economies are still knocking on your door trying to get this financing for now?
You know, we see both poor countries and middle-income countries trying to do renewable energy. The low-income countries are faced with a dilemma. You're elected, you promise great things to your people, and you have the option to go quickly, kind of dirty, and achieve rapid economic growth at a low cost probably, because today fossil fuel is cheaper than the renewable energy. despite actually the concessional money that is available for renewable energy. Or you go renewable energy, but the issue there is, are you able to attract the concessional financing from the climate funds, for example? If you don't have the capacity to develop those kind of projects, you don't have the capacity to build the institution that can, it's complicated. When you want to have money from the Green Climate Fund or the Global Environment Facility, you have many forms to fill. And actually, you even need to know that those funds exist. Some countries maybe still don't know. And it's our job as the bank, when we are contacted, to make sure that those funds are available. But the process is very cumbersome. The Green Climate Fund has $10 billion, and less than $3 billion has been disbursed, as far as I know, and Africa did not receive a lot of that, right? So we need to improve that, and the governments coming to us with their project, but we need to help them access that funds. We need to help them develop those projects, whether they are green or less green.
Come in, Governor.
I'm not sure I agree completely with what my colleague has just said, because it seems to suggest that you might be faced with a situation where you have to make a choice, and you find that fossil fuel will be, technologies might be delivered faster. Well, the evidence in South Africa seemed to point to the contrary. We added power to the grid much quicker with renewable energy, 6,000 megawatts, faster than it had taken us to add the units on our coal-fired stations, power stations. So I agree, technology is moving very fast. So these things, whereas they previously might have been expensive, or they might have taken long to bring on stream, the technology has moved so fast that these things are actually able to come on stream quickly. I can't talk about the Global Environmental Fund and all of those. That's global bureaucracy. The truth of the matter is that it happens with the MDBs too. I mean, I had to negotiate with some of the MDBs. Quite frankly, it took us 3 days to get $2 billion from the markets, and it took us months to negotiate a small amount of money from the MDBs. So these things, and these things are designed. Remember what I said about bureaucrats? They are designed by us bureaucrats. So even the rules of the Global Environmental Fund, some bunch of bureaucrats sat together and they decided that these are the rules we are going to need, and in the process made it difficult for the funds to be accessed.
Actually, if I may, I mean, when I say that actually it's faster, I mean, it takes time actually for these renewable. It's not really what I mean. What I mean is that if a low-income country that is not South Africa has nothing, you cannot go do IPPs and renewable because you need the base load. South Africa has a big base load.
Right.
So the incremental need, you can go renewable energy. But some countries who don't have nothing, you have the choice for your base load hydro. This is the best renewable you can get, or geothermal in some countries. If not, you cannot just do solar because you don't have the batteries. They still cost very expensive. Yeah.
So one final thought then, unless there's any questions from the floor. Oh, okay, we have a question over here.
We're speaking a lot about the technology. It'll be great to get the panelists' views on behavior changes, because the green economy is not just about introducing solar, it's also about bringing the communities along in effectively using what they have. Better usage, and I think a lot of us in Africa and even abroad, but particularly abroad, in terms of habit changes and what are the incentives we can do, because that could take a percentage of the needs going forward.
Minister, do you want to take that one and also perhaps address where you think are the most the examples that you look to, that you'd like to emulate, whether it's in Asia, in Singapore, in parts of Switzerland, the home of the World Economic Forum, or in German towns, places where you think the behavior change has worked in sync with the technology advancement. And in addition here, We have a microphone just here.
I think it's a corollary to your own question, which is that, Rwanda is an outlier in terms of the way they have integrated the idea of green development as part of economic strategy for developing the country. That's totally different from what you see in some of the other economies that are still seeing a binary relationship between green and growth. And so if you're having this kind of a conversation, you've got a middle-income country, South Africa. The project that he was talking about, I happened to have been the one who got stoned for doing a coal operation at the World Bank for ESCOM in my days in the World Bank as a VP for the Africa region of the bank. You've got a middle-income country. Through that operation, you completely launched your green economy strategy. And it's unimpeachable. The problem is, how then do you build a perpetual capacity to just keep the economic growth at par with the kind of need that you have for green energy? For the rest of the continent, Rwanda becomes an important example. We need to be able to showcase the evidence that the issue of green growth is not just about energy, as you rightly said, Minister. Agriculture, productivity, yield on the continent is going to be affected. A lot of conversation around that doesn't happen. In terms of the issues of the land and the desertification and some of the conflicts that we have, they need to be addressed. Some of those kinds of topics have to make it into national development plans. But you know what happens? The climate change lovers are isolated in some segment of government, having their sophisticated talk, while the rest of the economic strategy are going off in a different direction, never coming together. How are we going to solve that? Because the idea that let's deal with reducing poverty, then we'll come and talk about climate change. There's no such thing. We've got to do both. So it's green growth going together. But there's a political capacity, economic space that no one is feeling in terms of forcing that dialogue around the entire continent.
Thank you. Minister, perhaps you could just say a few words about how you've created that symbiosis and put people in the same room.
Yeah, thank you very much, Obi. You're still great as usual. And your points shows the Vice President of the World Bank, and she made her own contribution in her small way, being an African, of course. But we thank you very much for your thoughts and your contribution. And indeed, let me just give you an example. In Rwanda, we had scattered settlements, as you could find in any typical African country. Everybody living everywhere. You could come and take over the land and be everywhere. Because we are a small country and high population, we decided to develop what we call the group settlement, so that people live together, so that there's more space to do other things like agriculture. But still, there are some families which are far away, always from the main grid. Those ones in the in the group settlements, they depend mainly, especially on the grid, because it is even cheaper to give them electricity. For the others, where we are saying we need to scale out the renewables, for them what they need is electricity. There's no behavior change of anything. All they need is energy. How can you help us get energy so that we can move on? And that's why we brought in so many companies. We even did our research on really the cheapest way how to do like solar. We saw in Mexico, I think it has the cheapest, 3 to 4 cents per kilowatt hour. We saw the Zambia one, which is slightly over 6 cents per kilowatt hour. We are learning from many countries. We are working with the World Bank Group to see how do we make it cheaper. We even borrowed money, 50 million, to make sure that we can provide incentives, but also help the families that are not able to be able to afford the energy itself. We are using our financial institutions to do that. We have designed the projects. We don't see any, all they need is energy. Whatever the form of energy, all they need is energy. Because what we have seen is that once you have the roads, once you have electricity, and if you see how electricity transforms the rural sector, it's very, very quick. Everything changes almost when they have electricity. So whenever you're talking about really poverty reduction, energy has a huge component in this. But I think what matters for us, that is very, very important, because as a small country, high population, mountainous country, we are very sensitive to environment. And that's why we said it's a cross-cutting issue. It's in everything. Because our land, if we didn't take environment into consideration, it would be very, very difficult. And when we are doing the land registration, all the land in Rwanda is registered. Everybody, you have your own title deed. We know which land belongs to who. You can see it in your own, if you put in your ID, you'll be able to see the kind of land. Once we did that, and the land ownership, then we had to educate the people how to take care of it. It is easier when you own your own land, and you have to play by the rules on how you use the land. At the same time, agriculture, we cannot really have modern agriculture if you don't take into consideration the environment. The same thing with water, the same thing with energy generation, the same thing with construction, the housing, and all that. So for us, it's a cross-cutting issue. It's not just in one area. It's not only solar. It is really how to make sure that for us, tree planting, the whole cross-cutting nature becomes a way of life because we have no other choice. We cannot continue to, it affects economically, socially, and also, of course, behavior. It has other implications, and that's why we made it a way of life, that there's no other way, whether it is transport, vehicles, whether it is agriculture, whether it is anything. This one is a cross-cutting issue, and it has to be integrated in every policy and monitored that way. If it's not done that way, you may have one project and you say, this is wonderful, but it has to be cross-cutting. It's not just one project or one sector. It is every sector.
I'm being told we need to wrap up now. It's a cross-cutting issue for policy. There's a template there, plenty of lessons for other countries across the continent. All that remains is for you to join me in thanking the panel for their thoughts today, and thanks for your attendance. Enjoy the rest of the summit.